The resurrection of Jesus is not just a story passed down through generations, but is supported by historical accounts from multiple sources. The accounts of the life of Jesus that are often called the Gospels. The first piece of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is the verifiable reality that Jesus' tomb was empty 3 days after his crucifixion and nobody could produce his body. The second piece of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is that independent eyewitnesses reported that they had actually seen him in the flesh after his death. Those of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John all record the events surrounding Jesus' resurrection, providing detailed descriptions of the empty tomb, the appearance of Jesus to his disciples, and the reactions of those who witnessed these events. Those accounts talk about Jesus appearing to different types of people, even skeptical people like Thomas, sometimes indoors, sometimes outdoors, sometimes individuals, sometimes groups. And they're not described as simply visions or apparitions. At times, those people touched Jesus and ate with him. The appearance occurred over several weeks. Non-biblical sources such as Josephus and Tacitus, Jewish and Greco-Roman historians around the time of Jesus, mention not only Jesus' crucifixion, but the belief among early Christians that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And then, crucially, as we talked about in our last episode, one of the most interesting historical texts is Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Twice in that letter, Paul talks about Jesus being raised from the dead, and in chapter 15, he talks about the appearances of the resurrected Jesus to Peter, then to the 12 others, then to the 500, most of whom were still living. The Gospels are written within the lifetime of Jesus' followers, and Paul's letter was written only 15 to 20 years after the death of Jesus. Every historian agrees about that. For historical accounts, and particularly for historical accounts 2,000 years ago, this is incredibly close to the actual events they are recording. By claiming these eyewitnesses, both the Gospel writers and Paul were inviting anyone who doubted that Jesus had appeared to people after his death to go and talk to the eyewitnesses. They couldn't have made such a challenge if those eyewitnesses didn't exist. In addition to that, the accounts of the resurrection and claims of eyewitnesses were too problematic to be fabrications. Each gospel states that the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection were women. 2,000 years ago, women had a low social status and weren't considered to be as trustworthy as men. For instance, their testimony was inadmissible evidence in court. There was no possible advantage to the early church to recount that the first witnesses were women. It could only have undermined the credibility of the testimony. As historian and New Testament scholar N.T. Wright argues, there must have been enormous pressure on the early proclaimers of the Christian message to remove the women from their accounts. But they couldn't. Why? Well, surely because the records and accounts were how it actually happened, and the eyewitnesses were still living to tell their story. Christians proclaimed Jesus' resurrection from the very beginning because they saw something, or rather, someone, who convinced them this was the case. This was not a made-up story or the result of Chinese whisperers as rumor, conjecture, and mythology passed from one generation to the next. These are not accounts that were fabricated years later. Whatever else we would believe, or whatever else happened, the tomb of Jesus really must have been empty, and hundreds of eyewitnesses must have claimed that they saw him bodily raised.